Hi, this is George Graybill, and I would like to read chapter 5 of the memoir, and Folly. But first, at the end of each chapter, I've always included what I call vagrant thoughts, and I forgot to do that at the end of after chapter 4, so here are the vagrant thoughts for chapter 4. First, calling a boat she always feels a little kinky to me. Memoir. Isn't that what you write when you're just about to cash in your chips? I worry about why I'm writing this. Physically, there seems to be a lot of gas left in the tank. Creatively, someone please tell me. Exotic only feels exotic when you first come ashore. With time, it steadily degrades to boring. All right, then, on to chapter 5, where I get lost in a Molokai jungle with some friends. And after finding my way back home, I meet an unusual woman in a tea shop, and we spend the night on a little offshore island. All right, then, let's begin chapter 5. Chapter 5. Meanwhile, back in the jungle. I want to flash back to Hawaii again, and I can't think of a good segue. The year after I got divorced in 1968 was hard. I gave up my apartment and traded my VW Bug for the VW camper van. I worked on my thesis research, which was really a pretty easy project. Linus Pauling had already developed and demonstrated the technique of magnetic titrations. The only innovative thing I did was design a better apparatus. When Linda and I had split up, we agreed that if it was too hard for either of us, we would get back together. I completely forgot the agreement. When she called and said it was too hard, I told her it wasn't, and I was sure she could do it. It's dredging up memories like this that make me want to quit writing this thing, but how much do events from 50 years ago really matter? At this point, I don't know. The next year, my last year in Hawaii, was much better. It began with the great Molokai Expedition. Fred was a good undergraduate friend. Remember Fred, Karen's boyfriend? Fred had a friend, Jan, who had been born and raised on Molokai, even though he was a Holly. His father was a biologist or something for Dole pineapple, I think. At that time, Molokai, like most of the islands, was covered in pineapples. Jan's father made a lot of money keeping the Molokai pineapples healthy. Jan was planning a backpacking trip across Molokai, and he was looking for people to go along. He invited Fred and another friend, Chris, that I didn't know. Fred and I invited Lou. Remember Lou? The plan was to hike up the fairly steep southern slope of the island to the edge of Waialau Valley, climb down the cliffs surrounding the valley, and follow the main stream out to the beach on the north shore. This was the only way to get into the valley, other than by boat or helicopter. The distance was only 10 miles. When the valley had been populated, the Hawaiians used to hike out in one day to get supplies. Near the south shore is a heiau they built out of river rocks that they carried out of the valley. How hard could it be to hike in? We all flew to Molokai and spent the night at Jan's parents' house. Early the next morning, Jan's father dropped us off at a point that had once been the end of the trail the Hawaiians had used to access Waialau Valley. The other four in the party had limited backpacking experience. I had done a moderate amount of backpacking, and my gear was adequate at best. Somehow it turned out we had accidentally brought everything we would need, such as 100 feet of rope and a machete. Fred liked to romanticize any endeavor, so he wore a pith helmet and brought the machete. After an hour of flailing about in the brush, we hit a ranch road. We followed it uphill until it turned into a cow path. Looking back to the south, we could see the islands of Maui and Lanai. The path eventually entered dense jungle and disappeared. Now we were in a dark forested swamp. We were in a part of the island that has an average annual rainfall of 300 inches. It rained off and on as we moved uphill. Even though the slope was moderately steep, it was still a swamp because the water couldn't run off fast enough. Everything was growing on top of everything. New life flourished from dead logs. Tree ferns, vines, twisted trees, mud, rain, and darkness. As dusk fell, we suddenly arrived at the rim of Wailau Valley. Descent looked vertical. We worked our way gingerly along the edge until we found a spot that was flat enough to camp. We had ascended about 3,000 feet. The next day, we tried following ridges into the valley. The ridges were steep, but we could get down them with the help of the rope. In the first 2 or 3 ridges we tried ended abruptly in a vertical drop-off, and we dragged ourselves back up. I managed to climb a tree to get some perspective. There is a ridge over there that looks like it goes to the bottom, I said. We have to traverse the top end of the ridge. We started scrambling up and down ravines, cut into the Folly. We were almost to the promising ridge when it got dark and started to rain. We were still on a very steep slope, but we found a marginally level spot formed by the root ball of a large tree that had recently fallen. I had a sheet of black plastic that was my excuse for a tent. We all crawled under it and tried to sleep in the mud. I think I remember somehow making coffee for everyone the next morning, and we were soon on the Glimmer of Hope ridge. The slope of the ridge was not life-threatening, but the ferns were murder. I think they were called false staghorn ferns. They grew in a tangled vine-like mass to heights of 20 feet. But we had Fred's machete. It was exhausting work, but we took turns hacking and steadily tunneled our way onward and downward. At last we burst out into a stream. Even at the back of the valley, the flow was quite strong. In unison, we dropped our packs and tore off our clothes, jumped into the water, and started scrubbing away 3 days of mud and sweat. The beach was 5 miles away. We hiked all the way in the stream. It was almost all done by slow, acrobatic rock hopping. There were a few places where we had to deal with waterfalls. One person would climb down without a pack, receive a pack on the rope, and then wade through the pool with the pack over his head. As we moved down the stream, the flow increased to that of a small river. We spent one carefree night on a sandy river beach. Someone broke out the magical pot mentioned earlier. This was the ancestor of the pot that inspired the going away party. Without the anxiety of facing an untimely death and confident that we would reach the beach tomorrow, the high was beyond pleasant. There were voices in the stream and messages in the stars. Arriving at Wailau Beach was exhilarating. It had taken us almost 4 days to travel 10 miles. Wailau stream poured across the middle of the beach. Each end of the beach ended in sea cliffs. There was one nice sea cave. The remains of a Hawaiian village were behind the beach. There was a house platform and abandoned taro terraces. Taro that had gone wild was enormous, with leaves the size of a dining room table on 12-foot stalks. Lou had brought a rifle, which we regarded as odd at best. I understood. Lou and I were both raised in Pennsylvania, and I recognized him as a typical Pennsylvania deer hunter. Of course he brought a rifle. We had seen semi-wild feral goats in the valley. On the second day, Lou went upstream, shot a goat, and carried it back. Naturally, he knew how to skin it and clean it. We tried roasting chunks of the meat over a fire, but it never got tender enough to chew. Jan said, "This won't work. We have to emu it." And good old Kanaka Jan. "It works like this. Dig a pit in the sand and cover the bottom with rocks. Build a fire on top of the rocks. When the fire goes out, wrap the goat in leaves and throw it in, followed by more rocks, another fire, and sand on top. Wait a day and dig it up." The meat was tender and tasted better than anyone expected. The other weapon we brought was a Hawaiian sling, which is a fishing spear propelled by a thick rubber band. Someone brought all the parts except the shaft, which we made from bamboo that grew everywhere. Jan was a strong swimmer, so he put on a mask and snorkel and braved the high surf and currents to go fishing. He had no luck. Somewhat later, I was wading across the mouth of the stream and I saw a fish. I went back to camp and returned with the spear. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. There were lots of these little fish. Their only defense was camouflage. They blended in perfectly with the gravel of the stream bed. After I returned to spot them, I saw them everywhere. They were 6 or 8 inches long and tasted like trout. Winter storms had created a huge pile of driftwood, all in just one spot, high up on the beach. It made excellent firewood. One night, someone got the idea to set the whole pile on fire. It was a spectacular bonfire, and we kept moving back as the intensity of the heat increased. Suddenly, there was an explosion, and something whizzed past us. On the second explosion, we ran for cover behind a dune. It was like a World War I movie. It turned out that the driftwood was hiding a pile of river rocks that the storms had also deposited. When a rock got hot enough, the water inside it turned to steam and exploded, sending shards of rock in all directions. We could hear the shards zinging over our heads. We were trapped there for a long time. By friendly fire? I guess. The magic pot we smoked at night seemed to be getting better. Our ears developed new powers. We could listen to a breaker crash and then separate the sound of that wave from the others. As it approached, the frequency of the sound increased until it died out on the sand with a high-pitched whine. I spent a lot of time following waves with my ears and watching the stars spell out my name. The trip back to the South Shore was hard, but not as bad as the trip in. We spent the first night at the base of the Folly and the second night at the top. When we reached the rim, we didn't know where we were because we had taken a different route up than we took down. We worked our way south until we came to a steep downslope. A study of the topo showed that this could only be one of 2 locations. We either had to descend the slope or move away from it. We couldn't tell because a dense fog had come in and we couldn't tell what was at the bottom of the slope. If we guessed wrong, we would be screwed. Then it started to rain. We decided to huddle under the tarp and hope the fog would be gone in the morning. We were cold, wet, and muddy. We finished off the last of the old Charlie Yamashiro, which helped for a while and then made us colder. This is how winos freeze to death, right? When we woke to the morning light, the fog was still in. And Jan said we needed to make a sacrifice to a certain Hawaiian god, whose name I've forgotten. I threw an extra kazoo into the mist, and the fog lifted immediately. We turned, walked away from the downslope, and descended to the South Coast Highway without further adventures. I've done a lot of backpacking in the 50 years since, and I've never been on a trip that was more difficult or benefited from so much good luck. So many times we were just one dumbass mistake away from disaster. I returned to Oahu in high spirits. My mood was something like, well, yes, slogging through the bloody jungle was just tiresome, but I did find Dr. Livingston and he sent his regards. One night around that time, instead of bar hopping, I checked out a new hippie tea shop. I think it was called the Tao. The menu was mostly tea, coffee, being maybe two establishment. The restroom was papered with pages from the Tao Te Ching. I liked the vibe. I bellied up to the bar and ordered a cup of oolong or something. Taking a sip, I somehow fumbled the transfer to my mouth and did a goofy juggling act resulting in not spilling any tea or breaking anything. A woman with long, wavy black hair on the stool beside me turned and laughed out loud in my face. The next thing I recall was me asking, would you like to get stoned? Oh, sure. We went out to my camper van and smoked the remains of the expedition pot. We drove to her apartment not far away, kissed, and she said, tonight won't work. My ex-husband is here and he'll threaten to kill you. How about Wednesday? So this was Holly. I remember that as we floated through the infatuation stage, the world around us became perfectly idyllic. Our delusion lasted a few weeks and then we settled into a more realistic but comfortable relationship. During the deluded phase, we spent a night on a small offshore island. You could wade to it at low tide, but not many people did because it was a restricted bird sanctuary or something. There was a perfect crescent beach hidden to view from the main island by a fringe of ironwood trees. We swam, lay on the beach, and spent the night under the black tarp tent I had taken to Molokai. I don't remember ever wearing clothes. After wading back to the mainland the next day, we had dinner in a small restaurant that catered to locals. It was all very romantic. The food was delicious. The people were wonderful. The primo beer was pure ambrosia. A year or so later, I stopped at the same restaurant because I had such fond memories of that night. Now the food was terrible, the waitress was surly, and you could smell the restroom. For some reason, I don't feel like describing our sex life in close-up detail. In general, it was innovative and humorous. Our lack of commitment made things easygoing and delightfully shallow. We experimented with feathers, hot and cold oil, dessert toppings, and outdoor settings. We developed a stand-up comedy routine that was all inside jokes. I would say, my grandfather drove a stagecoach in the Old West. Strange thing was, it didn't have any wheels. She was supposed to say, what held it up? And I said, bandits. Holly came up with endless ways to screw the joke up. Did I ever tell you about my grandfather? Did he have wheels? We would crack up and people would scratch their heads. The few fights we had were my fault. My friends all said she was too good for me. At 38, she was very good looking. I thought she looked like Ava Gardner and On the Beach. She said other people had always said Elizabeth Taylor, and that I should have seen her when she was a teenager. I was spectacular then, she said, like she was just stating a fact. That was when I learned about sex. I had this uncle. She married in her teens, became a classic Southern California housewife, and was raising her 4 daughters when she met Joe at a Mexican resort. She ran off with Joe to San Francisco, where they lived the high life for a while, opening night at the opera and all that. But then she discovered drugs, the merry pranksters, and the whole counterculture. She started slipping out on Joe. She had some scary stories from that period. I used to slip out the window at night and party with my friends and see other men. One night I woke up on a houseboat painted Chinese red in the Sausalito yacht harbor and had no idea how I got there. I got busted in Reno once. I gave the sheriff a blowjob and he let me go. It got to a point where Joe couldn't handle her lifestyle and she couldn't handle Joe, so she and Jetty tried to hide in Hawaii. It worked for a while, but Joe eventually found him. Joe was 56 and an alcoholic, but he never got violent. Folly told me, he'll threaten you, but he'll never lay a hand on you. That's how he works. He will sense your weakest point and use it to hurt you. There's something about his appearance I can't quite put my finger on. That makes me uneasy, I said. Everyone gets that. You know what it is? People think he might actually be Satan. Joe certainly was a handsome devil. Holly's wide experience in living so many varied lifestyles and constantly reinventing herself made our relationship easier in one way. Unlike other women I knew, she saw nothing unusual about living in a van in the jungle. About a month before I left Hawaii, Holly's 26-year-old stepson blew into town from Nepal with $6,000 worth of hash hidden in the false bottom of a steamer trunk. We hit it off nicely. We probably went our separate ways at about the right time. I was beginning to sense that our thing was becoming less inspired. One of her last bits of advice to me was that I should sleep with a lot more women. The week before I left, Holly became a grandmother at 38. Vagrant Thoughts. If you haven't seen someone in 50 years, you can't help picturing them the way they were. Then it hits you. They are either dead or they look as old as you do. It's sad. Again, I have misgivings about how the preceding chapter would sound to someone else. My primary problem as a writer is my inability to put myself in the mind of a reader and sense their impression. Are people thinking, oh, he thinks he's so cool because he had this exciting adventure and slept with this exotic woman? What a pathetic jerk. If I were sure I was giving that impression, I would delete this file and quit. And that's the end of chapter 5.